everyone's having a good Photo Plus so far. Thank you for sitting here during lunch hour. I appreciate it. So, as Matt kindly introduced me, I got my start doing photography 6 years ago. I started photographing New York City with nothing but a point and shoot and a lot of determination. And I started sharing online, and I'm making a very long story very short and condensed, but I was fortunate enough to gain a very large online following through photographing New York City. And something that I was really focused on was photographing the more magical elements of the city that I've grown up falling in love with. Since I did grow up here, and I still love it as an adult, which is, I guess, unusual in some respects. So a lot of my New York photography is very whimsical. It's definitely a little bit steeped in my fantasy of what New York is, filtered through cinema, through art history, and through all sorts of things. So I've been really lucky to sort of have this evolution as a photographer and shoot what I want to shoot when it comes to New York City, and I've also transitioned into becoming a full-time fine art travel photographer. So I travel the world, and I do commissions for various travel clients around the world who pay me to basically photograph their cities the way that I have sort of photographed New York. One of my big passion projects here in New York that is ongoing forever, as long as it snows, is photographing New York City at night during extreme snowstorms. So it's something that I've done actually over the last 5 years, and I started the project on the point and shoot that I had, and I've continued it throughout my journey using Sony cameras. And the thing that's gotten a lot easier for me over time, as you can imagine, since I'm shooting in pretty extreme conditions, is shooting with lighter cameras that are smaller and that allow me more freedom when I'm out there bundled up, trying not to get frostbite and waiting for perfect moments. So the image that was just up and this image, these were both taken earlier this year. We had one major snowstorm, and I live here in Manhattan, and the weather service kind of decided to party with it and thought it was going to be the blizzard of the century. It was one of the rare times in New York history where all of the streets were emptied of traffic, cabs were not allowed on the streets, the subways were shut down, and buses were not allowed. So it was one of the strangest experiences I've ever had shooting snow at night. I basically put myself all the way up on the Upper West Side, and I walked home 77 blocks to photograph the streets. And it was one of the most magical experiences, although it was really cold and aggravating. And I actually shot this with the A7 II, which it's one of Sony's newer mirrorless cameras. The reason why I chose that camera, and I'll explain it a little, is because I was out, the snow was coming down pretty hard, there was a lot of wind, and I needed to be able to get as much light as I could, but everything that I shoot at night in the snow is handheld, so I don't have the luxury of setting up these shots well in advance. In most cases, I'm trying to capture really sublime imagery, so I only have like a split second to capture something, and I adjust my settings block by block to kind of make sure that it's going along with the light. So as you can see, this was in the Radio City area, so it's kind of flush with light and street lights, and it creates a really beautiful effect when the snow is falling quite a bit, as it was. And I kind of just wanted to capture the magic that was New York City at night with absolutely no cars in the road. So, you know, people were really having a ball. The few people who were walking around in Manhattan kind of like taking their bikes out, playing around in streets that are normally full of cars and cabs and buses, and just having a really interesting time of it. This was in the East Village. And by this time, I had already walked about 6 miles. And so something I want to discuss, since I'm talking a little bit about mirrorless and light, and I did bring one of the mirrorless cameras that I photographed with, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. But if you notice, the size of these cameras is unbelievable. So I did not shoot this with this camera. This is the RX104. I'm going to show you shots I've shot with this while traveling, where I'm in similar circumstances where I need to be shooting for different clients, and I need to be shooting things very quickly, and I need freedom to sort of be uninhibited by my gear and not look vulnerable and not look like I have a lot of gear with me. In fact, the other range of mirrorless are very tiny as well. Not quite as tiny as this, maybe just a tiny bit bigger, but you're still getting that same image quality and the same sort of like very appealing dynamic range that you would think that you would be getting with a giant honking DSLR, as everyone's sort of like come to expect at this point. So to kind of segue into this camera, I usually travel about 4 or 5 months of the year nonstop, and then I come back and work on projects here in New York that are commissioned. So this was kind of the beginning of my journey this year. I ended up going to Tokyo, and it was an amazing trip, and when I'm working for different clients, I don't have the luxury of time, as I mentioned before. So I don't have like all the time in the world to capture the essence of a city. Sometimes I literally only have maybe a few hours to really seek out an amazing location, get to the bottom of it, and distill the essence of that location with my imagery. And very often, the things that I shoot are used either for ad campaigns, marketing material, or sometimes they're blown up as prints. So I need to be shooting with cameras that are going to give me a certain quality and that are going to eke out as much dynamic range as I can, so that when things are displayed, if they're printed large for different clients or if they're used on like billboards, I'm really getting the most bang for my buck, and I'm also not inhibited while I'm traveling around. So this shot is really amusing for me every time I look at it, because it was in a part of Tokyo called Shinjuku. And Shinjuku has some very modern sections, but this is an alley often referred to as Yakitori Alley, and it's kind of like a throwback to old Tokyo. What was very interesting for me here is that I had this camera, and I had the A7S with me, which is actually what I was going to be shooting this alley with initially, and I had a wide-angle lens on it. And I ended up going into the alley, and I was with somebody else that I was traveling with, and we learned very quickly that people really didn't want the alley photographed. Because it's kind of a throwback to old Tokyo, there are people there who have very interesting pasts and interesting presence, and there's a lot of characters in this alley. And so my travel partner was actually unable to photograph. And I learned very quickly that having my other camera out that had the interchangeable lens was not going to work, because I was getting the eye from everybody, and it was really awkward. So I ended up pulling this camera out, which I hadn't intended to shoot this area with. And I ended up shooting the entire alley. I did a whole series of shots in the alley with this camera, and I was able to actually do that because as a female, when I travel, it was actually unusual for me to have somebody with me. I'm usually alone. And it's kind of a vulnerable situation to be in. You need to have street smarts. But sometimes you are in situations where you can't have a giant camera with a lens like this lovely person is using, only because it makes you stand out. Like I just noticed that you were taking a picture. And so when I went to this alley, that was the thing that made me fall in love with this camera. Because I was able to get the same kind of image quality, same great dynamic range, and all this stuff in something that fit in the palm of my hand and didn't make me stand out. And in fact, people were super happy once I pulled this out, and I think they just thought I was playing around because this looked like a very unobtrusive sort of device, when in fact, I was getting really high quality imagery from it. So this has kind of become one of the main cameras that I carry with me now when I travel, along with, I typically shoot with the A7S for video and the A7R2. And this is an overhead shot of Tokyo, also shot in Shinjuku. I was in the Park Hyatt Hotel, which is the hotel that was in the movie Lost in Translation. And I kind of had a really incredible view of the city, and I'm obsessed with overhead city shots since I mainly shoot cities, and I'm obsessed with the movie Blade Runner, so my interpretation of it kind of turned out very much um, in that vein. These actually were all taken with the A7S. I took them out of the window of my hotel room, and it's just like really incredible how much detail you can actually capture, especially in low light situations. For these shots, I didn't want it to be after nightfall. I wanted it to be that sweet spot between sunset and kind of like the nice dusky blue hour, just to kind of bring out the blues in the Tokyo skyline and really give everything that really amazing sci-fi sort of feel. And then this is kind of just playing around with some warmth. And that's another thing that I do a lot in my photos of New York that I do with travel as well. I play around a lot with tones, and that's why it's also really important for me to shoot with things that have great dynamic range, because I do so much work with tonality and trying to bring out different emotions through tonality in photography. And this is another overhead shot. Just love that skyline. And then I walked around a lot with the A7S. Really great camera. I was in the Ginza district of Tokyo for this shot. And again, just playing around with different sorts of color scenarios really brings out different things and different feelings in the photos. But for me, it was just kind of amazing to be able to shoot from the hip and not really worry that much about noise, about the general issues that you worry about when you're shooting at night, especially when you're shooting cityscapes and you're dealing with a lot of situations where you have a lot of light, a lot of neon sometimes. You're trying to capture movement, you're trying to capture certain specific scenes. So this is something I've really enjoyed capturing with the A7S, and there's something about also shooting with the A7S, aside from the low light advantage, where you can literally crank the ISO up to like insane amounts. I laugh every time I travel with the A7S and kind of do video with it now, or even still photography, because I remember when I started 6 years ago, the first camera I started with, if I went past ISO 800, I was praying that my shots weren't inundated with noise, whereas now I can really kind of crank it, I don't know, sometimes even to 20,000 ISO. This was not 20,000, I believe this was like 12,500 maybe. But I can really crank things up and still get that really beautiful sort of feeling and not worry so much about having a loss of quality with my night images. And just another different feeling in Ginza. I love that area of Tokyo, especially at night. It was really, really wonderful to photograph. And to kind of go to a different area of the world and a different client altogether, I had the pleasure of working for Visit Britain, who are the main people who deal with tourism in Britain. And I was there primarily to shoot music for British Airways. But while I was there, obviously I was traveling around and I was doing various other jobs for clients. And one of those took me into Brighton, which is a beautiful city in the south of England. Absolutely gorgeous, old-timey Victorian sort of seaside city with carnival rides and this amazing historic pier. And again, like this was taken with the A7S, and this wasn't actually taken for anybody. I was just sort of walking around. And I just find moments like these so fascinating, because I think that in the past, when we were a little bit more limited with ISO, you'd have to really like spend a lot more time setting up shots, and I shoot a lot from the hip while also waiting for certain moments to happen. So for me, it's like the moment of having the two bicycles really mattered, but I really wanted to get people in the shot for scale, so I kind of waited for the right people to walk, which made a difference for me in the shot. But it was nice not to kind of be hindered by worrying about ISO and knowing that I'm going to capture the really beautiful range of the colors in the sky as night was falling. And going back up to London, I did a lot of work in London this year for Visit Britain, and I had really good fortune of kind of getting shown around some really cool areas of London since I'm very interested in history and I'm very interested in um, fascinating aspects of cities. This is actually the area where Jack the Ripper did a lot of stuff. And if you ever visit London, it's kind of really popular to go on tours where people will take you around to different areas. And this, for me, like really encapsulated how I feel about London. You know, I grew up kind of with this very Dickensian version of London in my head. So it was really fun to kind of be taken around to these little parts and be able to capture the things that I've always thought London looked like. Of course, not all of London looks like this. Obviously, it's a modern city as well, but it was kind of nice to be in East London and hear the history, feel it, and then capture it with the A7S. And then this shot was taken when I was in Paris. One of my main clients is the country of France. So I work directly with France, and I spend a lot of time there going from Paris to different parts of France. This year I was in the Champagne region. Last year I was in the south of France for a month. And this was sort of like when I came back from doing stuff for them in the Champagne region, this is one of the views that I had in the Airbnb that I was staying in. And it was a really beautiful view in this district of Paris that I don't think many tourists really go to. It's the 16th arrondissement. And just there was just this beautiful, beautiful scene constantly out of my window at dusk. With the lights going on, and I shot this as a long exposure. I wanted to get a little bit of the movement in the leaves, that little blurring, because every night the wind would kind of rush through the leaves, there would be bats flying overhead, and just this scene was so absolutely beautiful, and not something I think people would automatically associate with Paris until you start kind of noticing the little chimneys that are so distinctive to the city. And then finally, I'm going to end up on one of the shots that I got in London. So while I was in London, one of my other main clients in Britain is the Shangri-La Hotel. The Shangri-La Hotel is a 5-star luxury hotel. It's located in the Shard, which is one of London's kind of like premier modern skyscrapers. And the thing that it has is this amazing view over London, where you get that amazing view of the bridge, you get the boat, you get all of that at night. The only problem was, as I've mentioned, is sometimes I'm in these places for only a couple of hours. So in this case, I was only in the hotel for a couple of hours. The hotel PR gave me access to a bunch of windows that I could use. The only problem is that if any of you have ever tried to photograph cityscapes through windows at night, you'll know exactly where I'm going with this story. The problem was that the reflections were absolutely horrific, because obviously, you know, they're not catering to photographers, they're catering to people who go up there to enjoy a nice drink and take in the view. So I had to kind of really struggle to get this, since I wanted to make sure that I wasn't getting a reflection, but the one thing I didn't have to struggle with was the light situation. So I actually took this with the A7S, and the only thing that I had to really figure out was how to block out the reflections, which I ended up doing with my coat. I kind of crafted this little hackneyed like thing with my little travel tripod, put my coat over it, and really tried to make sure that I was blocking out the reflections. And I really wanted to get this like super iconic shot for Shangri-La Hotel, and I felt very happy with it. And I think that, again, as I was mentioning before, it's really, like, it's amazing to me every time I travel how far I've come even in a year traveling with Sony, because when I traveled last year and I did a lot of my early France photography, I was still traveling with the A99, which, if you guys don't know the A99, it's similar in size to like a Canon Mark II or Canon Mark III. So it's giant, and like the one amazing lens that I would use is this giant lens, and it literally weighed something like 6 pounds. And I would go around with two bodies because I have two different lenses, and when I'm shooting in chateaus or in castles, I need to be able to have the most options available in terms of imagery, and it's just really heavy to carry stuff like that. So once the newer mirrorless line came over, I kind of gradually transitioned over, and this year I've been using nothing but pretty much the RX104 and then the A7S, the A7R2, because I've cut out pretty much about 8 pounds from my travel kit. And it makes a big difference, especially when you're dealing with airlines, when you're dealing with so much travel like I do, and I go on trains a lot since I don't drive. And so having that ability to have a lighter kit, but still not kind of like compromise on quality, has been something that's been really, really great. And since I only have like 5 minutes left, if you guys have any questions, I would be more than happy to take them. Oh, this. This was actually taken with the 24 to 70, the Zeiss 24 to 70. It's f4. Yeah, that was it. And I think I had it at 50. I think I had it at like 50 for this particular shot. And the reason why I cropped it to that was to primarily get this view and also kind of trickily play with the fact that I was dealing with reflections. So I don't use a fisheye lens. The widest lens that I use is the Zeiss 16 to 35. And when I use the 16 to 35, I typically shoot at like 18. 18 and 20 is like my sweet spot. Sometimes I go to 16, but it can feel a little bit much sometimes. This was actually taken with the 16 to 35. And this was shot at 18, because when I do snow photos, it's almost always universally 18. Only because I feel like it kind of makes you get lost in that aspect of stepping into the snow and the magic of the snow flying at you, which it was in this case flying at me when I took this photo. Are there any other? This one? Oh, this one is the RX104. And so actually I should mention, one of the reasons why I ended up also getting this, which I mentioned in my other presentation but I failed to mention, is I started doing YouTube because I needed to do something else, right? And I got it for the flip screen. So initially I was filming myself talking while I was traveling, and I hadn't even considered using it, weirdly enough, for stills. But once I used it in Tokyo and I realized the image quality was pretty much like rivaling the other camera, I started using this as a still camera as well. And the nice thing about this too is it has, it does fast. No, I mean, this is mainly still. The thing is that this actually captures 4K video. So, I mean, like, that's another thing that just blows my mind. So this camera captures 4K. It also does high frame rate. So another thing that I've been playing around with a lot in my motion photography, which I just started doing, is very high frame rate films. So lots of slow-mo, of city scenes, people walking through the city, fire hydrants that are open in super slow motion, stuff like that. So 4K. So 4K is super high definition video. It's kind of like where everything is heading in terms of video right now. I believe that Sony has a 4K display actually that's playing 4K. I think it's like right around there. And actually you see the fountain? They have the fountain set up with, it might even be with this camera where they're showing the high frame rate, how it's able to freeze motion while you're doing video. So. No. Mm-mm. Oh, that was the A7S, yeah. That was, the London shot is the A7S. This was the A7 II. So, and the nice thing about this too, like I said, is I really don't have the luxury of using a tripod, and I hate using tripods, in fact. So something that's really been helpful for me, like with the A7 II, and also with like the newer, like the A7R2, is all the image stabilization. Like this, I believe I was at shutter speed 1/20. And like, if I had tried 1/20 with a snow shot, and you're shaking because it's freezing, I just whip my gloves off and try to take a shot, I would have never been able to kind of isolate the silhouette in the photo. It would have been blurry because of the handshake. So that's something that's really helped me with snow photography and stuff like that. So image stabilization, to get so much light when you're doing nighttime photography, you're able to stop down with the shutter speed. Where normally, if you go that low with shutter speed, you're getting a lot of like blur, and you can't really capture freeze people in the frame. I believe the one that I just showed you was 1/20 shutter speed. So it's, yeah. I think they're going on to the next presentation. But thank you so much.
Thank you,
guys
Vivienne.
were wonderful.